Good morning. This is a makeup class for evidence. Today we're going to be talking about probabilistic proof. And one of the things that you probably learned or already know, given your own experience from the Dunkel case, is the fact that anything dealing with numbers can easily confuse both Supreme Court judges and I'm sure lay jurors. The problem in Dunkel was the court had some percentages and it had no idea what to do with the percentages. And actually, the logical error that the court made in Dunkel, I can't remember if I referred to this as an inverse error or not, but you'll see that that same kind of error is something that we'll talk about today when we talk about probabilistic evidence, and specifically when we talk about DNA evidence, because of course DNA involves probabilities as well. Okay, so here's what we're going to try to cover today. First of all, we're going to talk about the Collins case. Now, the Collins case is a very old case, 1970s, and it might seem odd to talk about that case when there's a lot more cases dealing with probabilistic evidence nowadays. The reason why Collins is a good case is because it's an unusual situation where the Lawrence tribe, who was clerking for the California Supreme Court at the time they decided Collins, helped to write that opinion, and then wrote a law review article expanding on the opinion in an article called Trial by Mathematics. And it's still considered a classic article in evidence. And it actually helps us to understand the enduring problems with probabilistic evidence that we see in DNA cases. So what we'll do is you've read the tribe's treatment of Collins, an excerpt from tribe's long tenure piece, as they called it back then, because in those days you just wrote one big article and that's what got you tenure in a law school. We'll talk about the 4 problems with the random match probabilities that tribe identifies in Collins, okay? Then we'll talk about Smith v. Deppish. As you know, Smith v. Deppish is a case from Kansas in which we can apply the Collins problems to DNA evidence, okay? So in Collins, the prosecutor says there's only a 1 in 12 million chance that a couple drawn at random from the population would match the characteristics of the true culprits. In Deppish, you have the prosecutor arguing that there's only a 1 in 500 chance that a black man drawn at random would have the DNA characteristics found at the scene of the crime. And so these two kinds of probabilities, we'll call these random match probabilities, which is the likelihood that a person drawn at random would match these characteristics. These random match probabilities are really identical in both Collins and Deppish, which raises the issue, does Deppish have the same errors that Collins has? Okay, so we'll apply the Collins problems to DNA evidence. And then we'll talk about other problems with DNA evidence. It turns out that the random match issue has pretty much been resolved as they've become more and more precise about the matches that they're able to make in DNA cases. There's still a problem called laboratory error. And one of the things we'll talk about is how laboratory error remains a serious concern even if random match error disappears, and how jurors have trouble in coordinating those two types of errors or integrating those two types of errors to make a fair assessment of the probative value of DNA evidence. Okay? And then finally, we'll talk about some other fun fallacies, and this is something I call Dershowitz's fallacy, named after the famous criminal law professor at Harvard, Alan Dershowitz, which makes it especially fun because we get to see a world-famous criminal defense lawyer commit a logical error. I'm sure one that he was aware he was making, because he's a very smart guy, but one which is, has some seductive appeal. And this will lead us to talk about the distinction between prediction and post-diction, because the error in the Dershowitz fallacy is that the probabilities calculated to predict something are much different than the probabilities that you calculate to post-dict, to say after the fact, what are the chances that someone is the murderer, given that a murder's occurred. Just to give you, just to remind you, Dershowitz was talking about the O.J. case. Okay, so here's what happens in Collins. Now, you have to remember this is 1968, so the language use is a little bit different, and I'll sort of modernize it for you as we work through it. But what happened in Collins is you have a standard case of eyewitnesses identifying robbers, okay? The problem in Collins is that the eyewitnesses weren't as strong as they could be. So there was some uncertainty expressed at the time of trial, and one of the witnesses' testimony was effectively impeached because of his greater uncertainty when he first made an identification at the preliminary hearing. So what the prosecutor did is the prosecutor said, okay, I'm going to rely less on eyewitnesses in this case, and I'm going to hire a mathematical expert who's going to help the jury to understand the significance of the fact that the eyewitnesses testified to certain characteristics that they remember at the scene of the crime, characteristics which were shared by the black man and the white woman who were jointly charged for the robbery at trial. Okay? So here's the things, excuse me, here's the things that we know. We know that the people who were the robbers were driving a partly yellow automobile. Okay? Secondly, we know that the man in this couple of robbers had a mustache. Thirdly, we know that the girl, and here, again, you have this 1968 language, we'll say the woman now, but the girl at the time had a ponytail. Fourth, we know that this girl had blonde hair. Fifth, we know that the man was a Negro man, now we say African American, and that he had a beard. And finally, we know that the robbers were an interracial couple driving in a car. Okay? Well, that in a normal case would be what you'd have. And you'd say, the eyewitnesses say, these are the characteristics we saw. They look and they identify the people sitting at the defense table. They say, those are the people we saw. The jury hears about these coincidences and says, is this really a coincidence or is this sufficient to find these people guilty? But the prosecutor, as I mentioned, was not happy with the eyewitnesses. They weren't as certain as the prosecutor hoped them to be. And the prosecutor, being a pretty innovative guy, brought in a mathematician. And the prosecutor said to the jury, I'm going to present this mathematical testimony to help you explain. But what I want you to do is I want you to imagine the likelihood that if these people are innocent, would they have these characteristics? Okay? And these are what we call population frequencies. Okay? The likelihood that people in the population have these characteristics. Because one way to think about if these people were innocent is to say, well, assume we drew these people at random from the population. What is the likelihood they would have these characteristics? And that's the same thing as a population frequency. So the prosecutor said, well, let's say, and you can come up with your own probabilities, but it's probably the case that only about 1 in 10 cars are yellow. That's where he gets the 1 in 10 probability or population frequency for partly yellow automobile. About 1 in 4 men wear mustaches. About 1 in 4 girls, 1 in 10 girls or women now wear ponytails. This is Southern California, so large percentage of women with blonde hair, so we'll say a third. About 1 in 10 Negro men wear beards. And what is the chance of an interracial couple appearing in a car? Whoa, 1968, 1 in 1,000. And you might just want to convict right there, right? Because we've got an interracial couple and they committed the crime, and that seems like pretty good evidence, at least in 1968. Although apparently, even today, I think interracial couples make up maybe 2% of the population. Okay. Now that population frequency, and this is the first time I'm going to introduce a term that may be new to you, is the same as a random match probability. It's the same thing. Random match means if you take someone from the population at random, what is the likelihood that they would match this characteristic? Okay? So we'll call them random matches because random match is the term that you see most often in the literature, in the cases and in the scientific literature dealing with DNA identification or other forms of identification. All right? Well, this all seems well and good. Prosecutor is telling the jury that you should be more scientific. You shouldn't simply say, oh, eyewitness says it was him, therefore it was him. You should say, well, what is it about him that makes the eyewitness think there's a match? How likelihood is that match to be a random match? And if you think about it, this would be a great way to handle eyewitnesses in general, right? Because eyewitnesses in general might have very poor ideas about the random match probabilities. They might be willy-nilly identifying people. They say, well, I remember the guy was black, he's black, therefore it's him. And if that were their reasoning, and the jury could uncover that and then say, well, actually a large percentage of LA is black, then they could recognize that the eyewitness was really not so credible. So this seems like a good approach. Collins says this is a terrible approach. And it mentions a series of problems that are identified in your reading. And actually, if you have your reading in front of you, if I were calling on people now, this is when you'd be on the hot seat, but you're lucky this is only a videotape class. But I would ask you, I'd say, well, what is the first problem with the random match probabilities presented by the prosecutor? Okay? And actually, if you look at page 2 of your additional reading packet, you'll find what the first problem was. Okay? The first problem, it says, The record was devoid of any empirical evidence to support the individual probabilities assumed by the prosecutor. In other words, the prosecutor just pulled these statistics out of his hat, right? Or some other place. And there's no empirical basis. There's no statistics that, he doesn't like look in an almanac and say, okay, this is the percentage. And of course, one of the things you should anticipate is to what extent are these problems going to be true with DNA evidence? That's the first problem. All right, now, what if the prosecutor said, okay, I've got an almanac here. Here's the percentages of African American men. Here's the percentages of men who wear beards. Here's the percentages of yellow cars. If he could do that, would these statistics have been useful? And that's something you want to think about, and think about your intuitions, right? First of all, you could say, well, in most eyewitness cases, we aren't presented with any random match characteristics. What we're presented with is whether the eyewitness thinks this person did it or not. So it's irrelevant what these statistics are. Another thing you might say is well, it doesn't matter if other people have the characteristics. What matters is if the defendant matches the eyewitness's description. But you should stop and realize that that's a fallacious approach. Okay, that's a terrible way to argue. Because if you really mean that, right, if you say it doesn't matter how many other people have the characteristics, you are ignoring the fact that we need to know how close a match is this, how firm a match is this. If the match is simply made on the basis that the defendant is the same race as the person that the person saw at the scene of the crime, it's a very poor match, right? Another way of approaching this issue is to ask yourself, well, it does matter if other people match the characteristics in the same way that we always search for an innocent explanation whenever we weigh the probative value of something, right? Remember when we were talking about abused kids? And we said, okay, is it probative whether a child has some kind of, starts to victimize other children sexually? And our judgment of how probative this is not simply an issue about how often do sexually abused children show this behavior, or do sexually abused children show this behavior, but whether non-abused children show this behavior, right? In other words, what we decided in looking at the statistics on abused kids is that in order to assess the significance of a match between a child's behavior and that of sexually abused children, we need to know how often non-abused children exhibit such behavior, right? Remember that? Now, if you can remember the reasoning for that, hopefully you can, then you simply can translate that logic into the logic we need to use for eyewitnesses. And we can conclude that to assess the significance of the match between the defendant's characteristics and those of the robbers, right, we need to know how often innocent people, here, general public is a good index of innocent people because the population is everybody innocent plus one guilty person, how often innocent people have such characteristics, okay? So it is important. The random match characteristics are important to consider. And if the prosecutor did have real statistics, there would be a serious issue about whether those statistics could be presented to the jury. Again, think ahead to DNA. Do we present random match probabilities to the jury? Yes, we do. Okay. So the court clearly had to have another problem because they couldn't simply leave it open for a future prosecutor to come in with an almanac. Clearly they thought there was something else that was wrong. All right. What is the second problem? Now, the second problem is easy to say, but potentially hard to understand. And so what usually happens at this point is I call on a student. The student dutifully reads to me the explanation out, and I'll do that for you now. And then the student says, I don't really know what that means. And that's great, because then I get a chance to teach you something. So the second problem is here on page 2. Even if the assumed probabilities were themselves correct, their multiplication under the product rule presupposed the independence of the factors they measured, a presupposition for which no proof was presented and which was plainly false. Yeah, okay, that makes sense. If two or more events tend to occur together, the chances of their separate occurrence obviously cannot be multiplied to yield the chance of their joint occurrence. All right. Well, let's take a closer look at that problem, okay, that problem. The court goes on to say, or actually Tribe goes on to say, summarizing the court opinion, that the witness first testified to the product rule of probability theory, according to which the probability of the joint occurrence of a number of mutually independent events equals the product of the individual probabilities of each of the events. This is the second error. It has something to do with this product rule. Okay, now we've got to slow down. We're going to talk about the product rule. Now, it's initially, if you don't have any background, say, in taking a course in probability, And I know I had taken probability, I think, like in junior high. It was the last time I remember doing this. So when I first started to read this stuff, it was obviously very difficult for me. And so I can understand if it might be difficult for you. So here's what I'll do. I'm going to put up the product rule, and then we're going to work through each of the terms that are italicized. So here's the product rule. The probability of a joint occurrence of a number of mutually independent events equals the product of the individual probabilities of each of the events. Okay? This is what the expert testified to the jury, and this is how the expert testified that the jury should use those different probabilities, those individual probabilities, to come to an overall likelihood that an innocent couple would match the characteristics of the people seen at the scene. Okay? So how do you take the 1/10th and the 100th and the 1,000? How do you combine those? And the second error that Collins is identifying is that that combination is purportedly according to the product rule, but that the product rule really doesn't apply. All right? Okay, so first, what is a joint occurrence? What does that mean? What are mutually independent events? And what is the product of the individual probabilities? So let's go through each of those issues. So that's the first problem, the probability of a joint occurrence. Joint occurrence is pretty true. It's pretty easy. Joint occurrence refers to when two events or facts are both true. That's what a joint occurrence is. And one way to make the math easy is to think about flipping coins, right? Because you know that when you flip a coin, the chance of a heads is 50%, the chance of a tails is 50%, assuming a fair coin, right? So think about flipping coins. So the probability of a joint occurrence would be like saying, what is the probability when you flip a coin twice that you get heads on the first flip and heads on the second flip? Joint occurrence means getting heads on the first flip and heads on the second flip. Okay? Now, in the context of Collins, it's a little bit different. It's not so much the chance of one thing happening, then another thing happening, in which case you say both things happened. It's the chance that one characteristic and another characteristic exist in the same person. So, in other words, it would be the likelihood that a man in a couple has both a beard and is African American. Okay, that would be called a joint occurrence. Okay, joint occurrence. Now, the probability of a joint occurrence of a number of mutually independent events. When are events mutually independent? Well, here the coin flips come in handy, because coin flips turn out to be mutually independent, although you might not think so. You want to be careful here. Does the likelihood that you get a head on the second flip depend on whether you get a head on the first flip? Now, a lot of people think it does, right? This is called the gambler's fallacy. They think, oh, I've got to get a head. You know, if the first one is a tails, then that increases the likelihood that the second one will be heads. And that's a fallacious way of thinking. That's the gambler's fallacy. And why is it the gambler's fallacy? Well, think about this. Think, you know, does the coin have a memory? Does the coin remember whether it was heads or tails? No. Does it matter? Like, let's say you've been flipping a coin and you say, oh, I can't get a heads out of this coin, so I'm going to start with a new coin, right? Would that matter? No. Okay. If it mattered, then it would not, these things would not be mutually independent. Coin flips are mutually independent because getting heads on the first flip doesn't affect the likelihood that you'll get heads on the second flip. All right? So they're mutually independent. Now, are these characteristics, black man, beard, man with mustache, mutually independent? We'll see that they're not. That's going to be a key problem. But before we come back to the problem in Collins, we want to understand the last piece of the product rule. Because the last piece of the product rule tells us if you have joint occurrence and you have mutually independence, now you can calculate something. What can you calculate? Well, you can calculate joint occurrences. So in the case of the coin flips, we can now calculate the chance, if you flip a coin twice, that you get heads on the first flip and heads on the second flip. All right? The chance of getting heads on the first flip is 50%. Good. The chance of getting heads on the second flip is 50%. Right? It doesn't change from flip to flip. Their product is 50% of 50% or 25%. Now, another way you can think about this is that you could enumerate all the different possible combinations, and they're all equally likely. So you could get heads, heads, right? That's the one we're interested in. You could get heads, tails, tails, heads. Those two are possibilities. And you could get tails, tails. So there are four possibilities, all equally likely. So the chance of getting heads, heads is 25%. The chance of getting tails, 25%. And the chance of getting heads once and tails once, without regard to order, is 50%. All right? Now, hopefully, you're already saying, oh, okay, so the gambler's fallacy is wrong if you think that the chance of each independent flip changes. But it is the case, if you're betting on a run, right, there's a greater likelihood that you'll get a mix than that you'll get a series of a particular heads or tails. We don't have to think too much about that. Because here, all we have to do is say, okay, we understand the probability of getting two heads. We understand it's 25%. How then do we go back to Collins? Well, what Collins did is the mathematical professor said to the jury, if you have these mutually independent frequencies, you can multiply the frequencies to find the likelihood that a couple drawn at random from the population would have all these characteristics, right? Would have the joint occurrence of all of these characteristics. And you can do the math. So 1/10 times 1/4 times 1/10 times 1/3 times 1/10 times 1,000. Good. I hear you saying, that's 1 in 12 million. You're great at mathematics, and you've multiplied things very correctly, you at home. I'm sure you've been on your calculator. If the conditions of the product rule apply. And what's the condition of the product rule that we've said is most important? Are these characteristics mutually independent? Are these characteristics mutually independent? Now, I'll tell you the answer and then tell you the reason. The answer is no. They're not mutually independent. And consider two of the characteristics. Consider this one, a man with a mustache and a Negro man with a beard. Well, let me ask you this. How do you determine mutually independence? You say, if I tell you that I've got, behind this screen, there is a African-American man with a beard, right? Now that you know that about this man, does that affect the likelihood that he also has a mustache, right? In other words, given that you have a beard, does that make it more likely that you have other facial hair? And hopefully your common sense will tell you, yeah, it increases the likelihood. The fact that you're an African-American man with a beard increases the likelihood that you have a mustache, because given some facial hair, you're likely to have lots of facial hair. So it increases the probability. Okay. Well, what effect does that have on the random match likelihood? If these two characteristics are not independent, if one actually increases the likelihood of the other, then the effect of using the product rule, which ignores dependence, is to underestimate the frequency of the joint characteristics. Okay? To underestimate the frequency of the joint characteristics. What does that mean? It means the probability frequency is underestimated. It means the random match is underestimated. It means it's not as rare as you think for an interracial couple to be in a yellow car and for the black man in the couple to have a beard and a mustache and the girl to be blonde and have a ponytail. It's not 1 in 12 million. Now, it's probably pretty still rare. I mean, we know if we just presented the evidence that we saw an interracial couple in a car, then we pick up any interracial couple and we can say that's 1 in 1,000. Okay? So we haven't solved the issue of how strong a coincidence this is. But we know at least now that there was an exaggeration of the likelihood of a random match. Okay. Court doesn't stop there. So what was the third problem? What was the third problem? Well, that's easy to see because you just look for the word third on page 3. The third problem with these probabilities was even if the product rule could properly be applied to conclude that there was but one chance in 12 million that a randomly chosen couple would possess the 6 features, there would remain a substantial possibility that the guilty couple did not, in fact, possess all these characteristics. Well, how could that be so? It's easy to imagine. How could it be that the guilty couple really wasn't blonde woman with black man? The eyewitnesses could be wrong. Right? The eyewitnesses could be wrong. And the eyewitnesses could be wrong because they could have some perceptual problems, and we know that eyewitnesses have perceptual problems. They could be wrong because they are lying, right? That's always a problem with witnesses. And they could be wrong because the defendants could have looked differently at the time of the crime. there's something called a disguise, right? So maybe there was this guy who was dressed up like a black man with a beard. Maybe this woman was wearing a blonde wig, right? And so maybe the true defendants, the true criminals, don't match at all. And the people we have on the stand, right, the people we have at the defense table aren't the true criminals, okay? So random match probabilities ignore error or falsification. And this is the quote from Tribe's article. They might be mistaken or lying, or the guilty couple was somehow disguised. Okay, we're not done yet with the errors and columns. And this last problem is, believe it or not, I think the most difficult problem. You might have thought that that independence product rule was difficult. But this is the most difficult problem. And this is the problem that's analogous to the problem that came up in Dunkel. And that comes up all the time in reasoning about probabilities. So what was this problem? What was the fourth problem with these probability noted by the court? Now here I wouldn't even ask a student to read this out loud because it's easier just to go ahead, put it up on the slide, and spend some time thinking about it. Here's what Tribe says. The fourth problem, it's going backwards now. Let me fix the slides, so just take a second. There we go. Now let's see if it will work. Okay, now we're working. Now we're working. The prosecutor erroneously equated the probability that a randomly chosen couple would possess the incriminating characteristics. I'll stop here and read this. Okay. 1 in 12 million. That's the random match probability. That's the population frequency. The prosecutor erroneously assumed this was the same as this. The probability that any given couple possessing those characteristics would be innocent. All right? This is tough because those two look like the same. And the fact that they look like the same is what leads people to assume that they are the same. All right? Now, another way of saying this is, given innocence, what is the likelihood that you match the characteristics? That's that first part of the quote. Okay? Given these characteristics, what's the likelihood you're innocent? That's the second part of the quote. Those two are not the same. This is like the problem with the Dunkel case. The Dunkel court had the statistic, given abuse, what is the likelihood that you abuse other kids? They were trying to get to the probability, given that you abuse other kids, what is the likelihood that you were abused? Right? What they had was the fact that given abuse, the likelihood that you abuse other kids is less than 50%. They thought that meant that given that you abuse other kids, the likelihood you were abused is less than 50%. And those two are not the same at all. It might be the case that given that you abuse other kids, the chances that you were abused is 100%. At the same time that only a very small percentage of abused children abuse other kids. Okay? Now, if you can remember that inverse error, that's exactly the error, the logical error that the prosecutor is making. And it is easy to imagine this happening. The prosecutor says, what's the chance a couple drawn at random would have these characteristics? Infinitesimally small. And even notice, if you ignore the product rule, if the prosecutor came up with some statistic, he could probably have given this 1 in 1,000 statistic to the jury. He says, look, we know an interracial couple did it. We know they're an interracial couple. There's only a 1 in 1,000 chance that a couple drawn at random would be interracial. Therefore, they're guilty, because there's only a 1 in 1,000 chance that they're innocent. Now, hopefully, you hear that and you say, wait a minute, that can't be right. If you understand that logic, then you understand why the inverse error is incorrect. So let me give you an easy example. And the way we make the example easy is we increase the random match probability. Right? We increase it so it's not 1 in 12 million. And if you don't have to deal with very tiny probabilities, the inverse error becomes easy to spot. And let's just take a hypothetical case in which the murderer leaves an extra large sized glove at the scene of the crime. Right? Amazingly sloppy. And the prosecutor establishes that the defendant wears extra large. Okay? Okay. What is the significance of the match between the glove and the defendant's hand? the prosecutor says, well, all I have to do is calculate random match probabilities. And it turns out that only 1 in 5 people, population frequency of extra large is 1 in 5. Can the prosecutor then say to the jury that there's only a 1 in chance in 5 that the defendant is innocent? Can the prosecutor say this establishes that this man with extra large hands is 80% likely to be guilty? Hopefully you'll say, well, no, that doesn't make sense. And how will you say that? Well, you'll say, well, look, okay, 1 in 5 people. LA County, make that our suspect group. 1 in 5 out of LA County, right? And LA County is what, 20 million people? So 1 in 5 is what, 4 million people? It doesn't establish an 80% likelihood that the defendant is guilty. It establishes a 1 in 4 million chance that the defendant is guilty. Now, that's an important point. Notice that in order to assess the importance of the random match, we have to think about the likelihood that the person is guilty who's randomly drawn. And what you've done is you've said the potential pool of suspects is LA County, right? When we come into the case, we don't know who did it. We have to start with a very low probability. And what the random match probability allows us to do is to multiply probabilities. It turns out that we have to have a prior probability of guilt in order to make any sense of the random match probability, right? What it allows us to do is to multiply the likelihood by the prior odds. And so when we take the case of the defendants, the interracial couple, we can't simply say that 1 in 1,000 turns into a 1 in 1,000 chance of innocence. We have to say, well, what's the likelihood of guilt when we first find out about this case, right? It's 1 out of, I don't know, a zillion. And then maybe we can multiply that by 1,000 to get the chance that this particular couple is guilty, but it's still a very, very small percentage. And actually, Tribe runs through this logic. So he says, let's say we assume the 1 in 12 million, but if the population is 24 million from which we're drawing these people, then they're likely to be 2 couples with these exact characteristics. And if there are 2 couples out there, only one of which is guilty, the likelihood really ends up being only 50%. Okay? So hopefully that makes sense to you, and hopefully this now makes sense to you. That the probability you match the criminal assuming you are innocent, which is 1 in 12 million, assuming Collins' statistics are correct, is not the same as the probability you're innocent, assuming that you match the criminal. And this error is called the inverse error. Inverse because one is the inverse of the other, right? Probability of match given innocence is the inverse of probability of innocent given match. It's actually quite simple once you put it in terms of conditional probabilities. Okay. Now, as I said, these errors, oh, and I used to show this because my former colleague Eric Talley and I used to teach quantitative methods, but that's ancient history, so let's forget about that. He's now at Berkeley, doing greater things, I'm sure. Okay, why did the prosecutor present probabilities? This is the thing to remember. Okay, this is the thing to emphasize about the case. The victim was unable to identify either defendant, and her neighbor's trial identification of the male defendant was effectively impeached. Okay? The prosecutor wouldn't have presented any mathematics at all were it not for these problems with the eyewitness. But important thing for you to stop and realize is if the victim had identified the victims, the defendants, right? If she did come into court and say, I am certain, and if the neighbor's trial testimony had not been impeached, would this eliminate the problems of random match? Of course not. You would still have those problems, and those problems would be obscured by the certainty of the eyewitnesses, by the lack of any reference to random match or population frequencies. And the defense attorney could argue to the jury that, you know, there are hundreds of people in LA County who have the same characteristics as this person, who the eyewitness would likely identify. But are we ever allowed to take the eyewitness out and show them pictures of other potentially matching defendants? Well, to some extent, right? We ask whether they pick them out of a lineup or not. But we don't pick out of a very large lineup. And because of that, the characteristics don't have to be a close match in order for an eyewitness to make a positive identification. And yet, it suffices for guilt all the time. Okay. So that's all I want to say about Collins. Now I want to move to the Smith v. Deppish case. Okay? Because as I mentioned before, Collins is 1971. It's a case where a statistician testifies in an eyewitness case. Very rare case. You say, this has no application to law. You're another law professor teaching pie-in-the-sky theory without teaching me practical reasoning about real cases. But this is totally practical, because in real cases now, identification occurs all the time. You might say, well, I'm never going to be a litigator, in which case maybe you won't ever face these issues. Certainly if you do any kinds of litigation in many different kinds of court, you're going to come across identification evidence. Criminal court, of course you will. Civil court, yes you will. Situations like paternity issues, right, where you want to know whether someone is in fact the parent, you're going to look at DNA tests, and you're going to look at the issues of coincidental matches. Here's the Depesh case. Kansas, 1981, motorcycle, three-wheeler, heard at the time of the crime. There's a woman murdered and raped. We're trying to figure out who did it. There's no clear eyewitnesses, no one who can say Mr. Depesh is the criminal, but there are ear witnesses who testify that they heard what they thought was a motorcycle at about 5:30, about the time the crime was occurred, and the defendant owns a motorcycle. Okay? The second piece of evidence is there was a shell casing from the defendant's .22, which he voluntarily fired for the police, that matches a shell casing found near the decedent. Third piece of evidence. There were two described as negroid body hairs found in carpet samples. Very kinky hair that appears to have come from an African American. The defendant is an African American. Now, one of the pieces of evidence was that the defense says, well, sure, I was a friend of the family and I'd been over to the house quite recently. But then the prosecutor rebutted it with the evidence that the woman had vacuumed in between the time he had visited and the time of the murder. Now here you want expert testimony on the efficacy of vacuuming in removing hairs from carpeting. I don't know if you remember the advertisements a few years ago where they said, here's our competitor's vacuum, and they ran over a carpet. And then they bring out their vacuum cleaner and they say, here's our vacuum cleaner. Look, we pick up dirt that they miss. What was funny about the ad was Consumers Union went back and replicated the commercial where they simply took the same vacuum cleaner, ran it over once, ran it over again, and they said if you run it over twice, you get more. So it's just doing it again is going to get more hair. The basic point for us is that you run a vacuum cleaner over a carpet, you're going to miss a lot of stuff. So the vacuuming probably had nothing to do, and the fact that he was a friend of the family who had been in the house is pretty good evidence that these kinds of things, the negroid body hairs, are totally innocent. But that wasn't what was interesting for us, although all of these things raise random match issues as well as innocent explanation issues. But the defendant's DNA type matched the DNA in the semen taken from the vaginal swab. And the reason why that matters for us is because we're interested in probabilistic evidence. This is where the probabilities really got going. And this is where the really impressive random match statistics get going. Although what you find in Depesh is, this was in the old days of DNA identification, where the random match frequencies didn't get freakishly small, right? They weren't like 1 in 9 billion, which is one thing that you'll hear frequently in courts today. They were only, say, or they were as great as 1 in 500. But here's what the prosecutor established. Smith had the same DNA as that found on the vaginal swab, and there's but a 1 chance in 500 that the DNA would match a person chosen at random, okay? Here's where Collins and the inverse error comes in. Does this mean that there's less than a 1% chance that someone other than Smith contributed the semen? In other words, does this mean that the chance that Smith is innocent is less than 1%? And hopefully you see that the argument is false. It is not the same. The prosecutor claimed it was the same. The experts told the jury it was the same. The jury took only about an hour to convict Mr. Smith, even though you'd say this is a classic case of circumstantial evidence. And clearly, the best piece of circumstantial evidence was the 1 in 500. But it's clear that the jury, I think given the speed with which they returned this verdict, it seems pretty clear that that 1 in 500 statistic stuck in their head, not as a random match frequency, not as increasing the likelihood of his guilt by 500 times over, say, the fact that he was just somebody in the neighborhood, but making it 99.9% likely that he was the guilty man. Now, that's the inverse error for you, and it occurs all the time. Of course, since we move to 1 in 9 billion, you might say, well, look, I can think about this intelligently, and you're telling me that it creates a multiplier over the prior probabilities. Okay, so take someone who's randomly selected from the population, take it even the world. If you get a 9 billion random match, right, 1 in 9 billion, and I multiply by 9 billion, that makes it very likely the person is guilty. And you're exactly right. You're exactly right. If random match and inverse error were the only problem, then we could be confident in DNA identification. Because even if we commit the inverse error, we can still say, ultimately, multiplying any probability of guilt by 9 billion makes it very likely that the defendant is, in fact, the criminal. So here were the problems that originally came up with DNA. First of all, it wasn't sure whether there was a good evidential basis for these population frequencies. And that's exactly like that first Collins error, right? Is there's no empirical basis. This problem has been largely cured. They now have developed population frequencies, and they're able to develop population frequencies for different races, which was initially some question, because races have different amounts of what you'd think of as interbreeding. That some races are more likely to procreate within the same race, and that would increase the frequencies of certain types of random matches. Whether the frequencies of DNA fragments are mutually independent. This was an issue, but this issue has largely been held to be irrelevant. That there are mutual dependencies, but they're not that significant, and we still can comfortably multiply these independent probabilities. Remember that Tribe says you still might have falsification or lying. Has this problem been solved by random matches? Not at all. The possibility of error falsification is still very serious. And here we run into another issue. What if the jury is given the random match probability, 1 in 9 billion? And then what if they're told the laboratory might have made an error? Remember what Tribe says? Tribe says that their attention is drawn to that random match. Their attention is drawn to that infinitesimally small probability, which then they turn into a, grotesquely large probability that the person is guilty. But they're asked about this lab error. They say, well, what about the likelihood that there was a lab error? How do they integrate that information? Now, Tribe says if they're not given a number, they have no idea how to integrate the information. So some experts are saying, you know what we need to do? We need to allow experts to testify to juries that the lab error is 1 to 4%, and actually 1 to 4% is empirically derived. The problem is that courts will say, you don't know what this lab error rate was, so you can't testify to any lab error rate, which is kind of amazing. The reason why we don't know the lab error rates is because laboratories do not routinely conduct blind proficiency tests. So the reason the defense can't offer the evidence is because the labs refuse to produce this evidence. Well, let's say you get a rare judge, and the rare judge says, okay, I'm going to let you give that 1% to the jury. Will that solve the problem? If the jury now is told there's a 1 in 100 chance that the laboratory made an error. Well, here's what Jay Kohler did. Jay Kohler is a professor of business and law at Texas. He's looked at a lot of different issues with jurors understanding or misunderstanding, and I think this is probably the most interesting one. He said, suppose the random match probability is 1/10 of 1%, okay? Very low random match probability. And suppose that the defendant presents evidence that the lab error probability is 1%. What is the probability that you'll either commit a random match or a laboratory error? Okay? You want to think about this. What's the likelihood that you'll commit either a random match or a laboratory error? Well, is the likelihood that either error occurs less than 1/10 of 1%? Right? Which would lead you to conclude that you have a large multiplier and that this is very good evidence that the defendant is guilty? Would the likelihood of error be between 1/10 of 1% and 1%? Right? Would it be somewhere in between? So it would be a little greater than the random match probability, but it would be a little less than the lab error standing alone? Or would the likelihood be more than 1%? Well, most lay people, when given this information, say we'll split the difference, which means they'll say it will be between 1/10 and 1%. So when they hear about the lab error rate, they'll say, okay, it's a little bit more than the ultimate error is a little bit greater than 1 in 10, but you still have a very high percentage right? You still have a very high percentage, and I mean a very high multiplier. And because of that, you still have a very high posterior probability. You still ultimately conclude that it's a very high likelihood that the defendant is guilty. When the actual answer is that it's at least 1% and more than 1%, right? Now, this doesn't seem so serious if you're dealing with a random match probability of 1 in 10, right? 1/10 of 1%. You're just moving things a little bit. But imagine you get a random match probability of 1 in 9 billion. It turns out that the lab error sets a floor on how convincing evidence can ever be, or I should say sets a ceiling, sets a limit on how convincing evidence can ever be. Because of laboratory error, we really can't say that any piece of evidence increases the probability of guilt by more than 100 times. 100 times seems like a lot, but if it's all you've got, right, if the defendant is otherwise drawn at random from the population, then it's not very good evidence at all. It's not very good evidence at all. But if jurors are combining 1 in 9 billion with 1% and coming out with 1 in 4.5 billion, then they're likely to be convinced by evidence, and they are not going to give laboratory error its due. And this is where the debates are really going on now, is can we introduce lab error statistics? Most courts say no. Can we require laboratories to have blind proficiency tests? Most labs still do not do so. Okay, so that's it for Collins. Before I get to Alan Dershowitz, let me say a few other things about the inverse error, okay? When you are the defense attorney, what is your strategy in the face of random match? Well, clearly your strategy needs to be if the random match probability is very, very low, then you do everything you can to try to get the lab error into evidence. If the probability is only relatively low, then you introduce the inverse error to the jury. So if it's, say, if the random match is only 1 in 100, then you say to the jury, you say, no, this is the way you analyze the evidence. Take a pool of people, right? Take the population of Los Angeles. How many people will match this characteristic? Well, 1 out of 100 is, several thousands of people. And it turns out that defense attorneys can effectively negate the significance of probability evidence using this kind of reasoning. In fact, you can get jurors to conclude that the evidence is irrelevant, even if it's 100 times multiplier, by having them think about the potential suspect pool as being very large. Okay? And that's been called the defense attorney's fallacy. So random match probabilities, if you're the defense, get jurors to think about the population from which people are drawn and get them to think about laboratory error. Okay, so now let's move to Dershowitz's fallacy. And Dershowitz's fallacy is a fallacy that came up in the O.J. case. And as you may recall, Alan Dershowitz was hired by the defense team. Now, he wasn't hired until after he had made a number of comments in the press, which actually kind of leaned towards suggesting that O.J. was guilty. But soon after he was retained by the defense, he came around to their view. And one of the arguments he made had to do with the potential relevance or irrelevance of the prior domestic abuse between O.J. and Nicole. And it's been speculated that the prosecutor relied too much on this because the jury afterwards said, oh, domestic violence occurs all the time. Lots of women are beaten up by the husbands. It's irrelevant. And actually, the argument that the jury made in being debriefed about their reasons for the decision were very much like Alan Dershowitz's argument. But as we'll see, it was fallacious. Here's what he said on the Saturday Today show. He was arguing with Ms. Gloria Allred, who was arguing for the significance of these prior domestic squabbles, or I should say domestic abuse, not to downplay them. Gloria Allred will tell you that there are more than 2 million, maybe as many as 5 million cases of spousal abuse every single year. But there are only about 1,500 cases of spousal murder every year, which means that 99.9% of all people who engage in spousal abuse don't then turn to murder. Okay? Now, he's totally right about the statistics. The numbers are accurate. He adds, and this is the advantage of being at Harvard, where you can walk across Harvard Square and run into a world-famous biologist, Stephen Jay Gould. Yesterday, he says, I ran into Stephen Jay Gould. Hey, Steve, how's it going? Good, Alan. You know what, Alan? The most fundamental fallacy of social science research, this is the conversation he had with Alan Dershowitz in Harvard Square, is to assume that just because killers may have engaged in battery, that it follows that batters will kill. Alan's like, hey, I might be able to use that tomorrow on the Saturday Today show. He goes on to say, you know, it's like that old marijuana-heroin fallacy, that old chestnut. Just because everyone who ended up using heroin started with marijuana, right, given heroin use, you used marijuana, doesn't mean that given marijuana, you're going to use heroin. And he's perfectly right. That is a fallacy. It's like the inverse fallacy, right? Totally correct. But Alan is totally incorrect, because Alan is saying that because we can't predict that a man is going to murder his wife given that he abuses her, then we cannot say, given that a woman has been murdered and she was abused by her husband is her murderer. The difference between the two is, has the woman died? The reason why it's difficult to predict murder is because murder occurs very rarely. But once a murder has occurred, you no longer have that problem. And it turns out that the probabilities of the two, prediction versus post-diction, are quite different. So if you're trying to predict, then Mr. Dershowitz is exactly right. Given that a woman is abused by her husband, the likelihood that he will kill her is 0.1%. Okay? Post-diction asks a different question, though. And actually, Alan Dershowitz was arguing about this on a panel discussion, and it was a professor of English at Harvard who turned to him and said, Alan, I hear your statistics, but let me ask you about this statistic. Given that a murdered woman was abused by her husband, what is the likelihood that he's the murderer? Because here we know an additional fact. We're not trying to predict Nicole will die. We know she's dead. We know she's murdered, and we want to know who did it. And Alan stumbled and muttered something about, well, most of the time husbands are the killers in these cases. And actually that's exactly right. But it turns out that whereas the percentage for prediction is 0.1%, right, 99.9% will not go on to kill their wives. Given that a woman is dead and murdered, the chances are 80% that given that she was abused by her husband, he's the murderer. Now, what Dershowitz now argues is he says, well, this really isn't that probative a statistic because given the fact that he's her husband, there's a 50-50 chance that he's the murderer. And it's kind of funny to argue that because another way of saying that is as soon as Nicole died, before we even knew there was domestic violence, we could say O.J. was the likely killer. Because that's usually what happens. You usually kill the one you love. The problem that the prosecutors had with this line of reasoning is the prosecutors couldn't admit that they knew right away that O.J. was the killer because one of the ways they were trying to get in evidence was to say that when the police jumped over the fence at Rockingham, they didn't know that O.J. was the killer. They didn't suspect that O.J. was the killer, and the fruits of their search, therefore, were not going to be suppressed. When it turns out that everybody, even Alan Dershowitz, knew that O.J. was probably the killer. In fact, in his book called Reasonable Doubts, and I'm not sure if the title refers to the likelihood of O.J. being the murderer or the propriety of Dershowitz's arguments, he says, as soon as the morning newscaster announced that the body was that of Nicole Brown, I told my wife, O.J. probably did it. The former husband is generally the perp in a case like this. Okay, so prediction is different than post-diction, and that's not even the last error that I want to talk to you about, and then we'll stop. J. Kohler has found yet another error, and this is an error that has to do with the way that one reports excuse me, that random match probability. So what he did is he took mock jurors, and basically what it means is he takes students who are pretending that they're jurors, but they're actually, if anything, probably a little smarter on average, a little more mathematically savvy than your typical juror in a real case. And what he says in one group of jurors, he says, here's what the DNA expert says. The probability that the defendant would match the blood drops if he is not the source is only 0.1%. This leads most jurors to commit the inverse fallacy and to conclude that the chances that the defendant is the source is 99%. Remember, that was the way that the evidence was presented to the jury in Depeche, is the likelihood is only 1 in 500 if the defendant is not the source. There's only 1 in 500 chance that he would match. So if you put it in terms of a probability, okay, if you put it in terms of a probability and you talk about the likelihood of the defendant matching, you will get the inverse error. But what if the DNA expert says what is exactly the same thing mathematically, but different conceptually? What if the DNA says 1 in 1,000 people in Houston who are not the source would match the blood drops? And notice this is the way that the defense attorney ought to present random match frequencies to the jury, is they ought to think about Houston, they ought to think about a large population, and they ought to think about innocent people matching, not whether the defendant matches. Here, 1/3 of the jurors were now 99% confident that the defendant was not the source. In other words, the DNA is presented in a different way, and the jury concludes the evidence is irrelevant, when neither of these conclusions is true, right? The actual fact is 0.1% is a good random match. It's good, strong evidence, assuming you don't have laboratory error, that the defendant is in fact the contributor of the DNA. But how you say it radically affects how jurors interpret it. Okay, so don't feel bad if you commit these kinds of logical errors, and don't feel bad if you have trouble understanding these percentages. This is a very common error. But feel good if you can figure it out, because to the extent that you can make an argument that either will lead the jury to, let's say you're a purist and you want them to reach the correct conclusion, or let's say you're an advocate and you want them to commit the fallacy either for the defense or for the prosecution, understanding how to make these arguments and how to present probabilistic evidence will definitely help you in your goal. That's all.